When I recently made my Joy of Comics video that I'll link up here, one of the key names that I addressed within that was Alan Moore. And if it wasn't for Alan Moore, that sort of a video may not exist. Like, it would to some degree. There'd still be a lot of great comics out there, a lot of fantastic artists working within the medium, past and present. But this guy's work stands separate to everyone else's. It's so influential, the way it draws in influences and then creates something new out of them. It's so inventive, it constantly reinvents itself as it goes on, and it's touched so many areas of the medium and so many artists from within it that I'd say he's easily the most influential comic book writer in history. Now, Alan Moore is a standout artist within this field. I mean, his work, more so than the general rise in quality in comics, which did certainly take place from the 80s onwards, and he was certainly a key spark for that, because he kind of showed other people within the medium, like, okay, sure, we're not making a lot of money in this area right now. It's not hailed as a fantastic medium of artistic expression and given the same intellectual gravitas as any other area, pretty much. Even movies, obviously movies themselves had a past as something that was fairly tacky, not very well produced, quite quickly churned out. But through artistry and then through the resulting success of movies, they became a legitimate medium of intellectual expression, artistic expression, very meaningful things that have changed people's lives. So his work was a key aspect in creating that for comics. There were great comics writers before then, but you have to really know about the history of comics. And even so, none that were really on his level. This guy legitimately is a genius. I mean, he absolutely, from reading his work, pretty much all of it, and from studying so much of it, I've read a lot of different art, a lot of different culture, experienced a reasonable amount in my 33 years on this planet. And this guy is the Shakespeare of this medium. He's just that guy who stands apart from everyone else because the sheer scope, scale, quality, consistency of his work is unbelievable. So for me, as a result, as you might be able to guess now, I think he's the best comic book writer of all time, and it's pretty clear cut for me. I've read a lot of the different authors out there, and this is the only guy that legitimately hits the highest peak, does it the most consistently keeps it new what he's doing, but manages to adapt to new genres and new styles of telling stories and new subject matter and become the very best in that in seemingly no time. His ability to create characters, some of them are just throwaways that go on to be classics, is unbelievable. He has so many stories where they're just like the best story, and you make a list and you almost feel like it's cheating. Like when I made that Joy of Comics video, it almost feels like cheating to list 10 Alan Moore stories over history, because I mean everyone else is going to get one or two, or they have this one series that's really great and then did a few other side things. He just has too much that's too good. I mean, it reminds me of when you look in the NBA record books, like Wilt Chamberlain just has like the majority of the records. Other people have like one or two, or if they were really great, like 4 or 5, and this guy just has tons of them. He has like tons and tons, and he's taken up so many of the top X seasons and scoring records in games. Just a person who's a titan of his field, in the same way as Alan Moore is absolutely a titan of his field. So for me, there's Alan Moore, and then there's everyone else. Now, listen, I think Grant Morrison's comics are fantastic. I find them so inventive. I find it really fun. It's a very fast-paced kind of a thing that you just let all the ideas fly by, and some of them are really cool. And then he does his own unique thing. I love Peter Milligan's stuff, the way he works with identity. Like Warren Ellis, he's just a guy who, in terms of like just the day-to-day scripts, really knows how to churn out a comic. Garth Ennis is someone who can just put it together. He has kind of more of a gritty, like real-world-based comics, but he really does great work within them. Mark Millar's fantastic at kind of like the celebrity, big type comics that aren't supposed to be super deep, but have a great polish to them and tell stories that are relevant to today. Obviously, you can go and you can look at someone like, let me think, who am I missing here? Let's see. I mean, Frank Miller's 80s stuff was fantastic. Alejandro Jodorowsky is a visionary in every sense as an artist. There's a lot of great work out there, but Alan Moore just is better than all these people from my perspective. And this is what I've enjoyed. And as an artist and as a complete polished person who has developed all these aspects of himself and doesn't have to rely on one key touchstone work or few aspects, and doesn't have such great ups and downs to his career. I mean, he was being so good for so long and in so many different ways. He just covers the whole gamut. So you start out in the early days, and already he's producing classics. I mean, one of the early things he did, which is absolutely fantastic and still in many ways stands the test of time, is the Marvel Man, later known as Miracle Man stuff, which, yeah, okay, it's not quite that polished. Like, the art's a little bit ropey, and some of the concepts, I mean, they've been sourced and stolen in so many movies and other comics, but it's still a fantastic story. And you can see already that this guy's going to change the medium, and he knows the rules, and he establishes his comics using the rules. He's a great example for me of where you learn the rules to learn how to do it best in that medium and what other people did well before, and that kind of builds up your credibility and builds up your resume of what you're doing, and you learn the basics of it. And then once you learn the basics, you can break the rules and you can do something revolutionary. So this is a great example of it, because he starts out telling this story that initially looks like it's just going to be a superhero story of the ilk of the 70s and the 80s. But then he gets to a point where not only does he start to break it, but this is the key thing. Alan Moore always takes something, whether it's not his in this particular case, someone else's thing, and it always becomes his thing by the end. That's how good Alan Moore is. It's a bit like in the field of music. If Boards of Canada remix a song, it basically becomes a Borders of Canada song. It doesn't matter what the music was before. They'll take it away, take out loads of elements, put in their own synths, their own beats, and suddenly it's a Boards of Canada song, even if the original ingredients was someone else's work. In the same sense, Alan Moore makes everything comic into his, and he makes it into his in terms of he always takes the scale of something and just puts it to like the infinity point. So whatever could normally happen within the box of the story and the lines and the limits and the genre, he will always take it and then eventually just exit from there and just go off to some incredible level where he's left the event horizon of what the normal story could have been contained within. And so in this story here, he starts gradually doing that, breaking some of the rules, doing crazy things with how violent it is and how crazy some of the actual storyline plots are. And then he just kind of thinks to himself, as he does with most of them, most of his great comic work, right? Okay, now where would this character go? Like, where would the end point be? Like, if I kept going with this philosophy, where would I get to eventually? And then not just stopping and going, right, well, that's obviously you couldn't do that with the story. No, just go, oh, I'm going to try that. And so where this comic ends, is crazy. And he's doing this stuff early in his career. And this is like early 80s material. Now, his most famous works, this is what makes Alan Moore's career so interesting but so misunderstood. His most famous works, generally, are the works from after that in the mid-80s, which eventually, I mean, some of them weren't actually done for DC, like Watchmen and V for Vendetta were in Warrior, but they become known as his DC period. So you've got Watchmen, you've got V for Vendetta, you've got The Killing Joke. These are his most famous works, and what most people, even the mainstream comics readers, will acknowledge are his best works. Now, they are some of his best works, but that actually really downplays him as an artist and what his career path has been, and also shows, and to me at least, betrays a misunderstanding of what happened with the rest of his career and how he affected the medium. Because, okay, look at some of these works. Watchmen. I think, for me, I've read a lot of comics. It's the best comic ever written. Like, what I love about it is, it has this watchmaker precision to how the story starts, how it ends, how it's crafted throughout. It's just got a level of perfection to it. I mean, a couple of movies that it reminds me of in that sense would be two of my favorites: The Heat, the Michael Mann film from 1995, and The Prestige, which I think was 2006, the Christopher Nolan movies, because these are ones where I even have watched the movies many times before. I know every part of the dialogue and every twist in the story, but watching it is almost like teleporting myself back in time and experiencing it again. Even though I kind of know what's coming next, my brain, the joy of going through the process of it is still very, very vital and quite essential to one of the reasons why this movie endures, in my opinion. So in the same sense, Watchmen is one of the comics with the most reread value of any in history. I mean, what's so great about it is, not only do you find new facets and nuances that emerge from it, but every character within the comic, as you reread it and maybe you pay more attention to them or see things more from their perspective, has their own distinct perspective within the comic. And it's not that one's right or wrong, or one's more essential or primary and the other one's secondary. They all have their own place within it. And I find that if you've read it enough times, you can actually relate to pretty much all the characters. They all have their own aspects to them that are interesting and other parts that show them to be flawed. I also think what's great about it, and one thing that's very underrated, people very rarely have a comment on this. They talk about, okay, how he deconstructed the comics medium, how he took comics and he brought them into the real world, and how this was like a postmodern approach to it. People say all these things, but one thing people never seem to tie with it is it's kind of noir for comics. Because in film noir, one of the key components is you're not supposed to just have a good guy, a protagonist who's the hero and does everything, and he's like overcoming all the bad guys, and then everyone. No, it's not. One of the great things about noir is this notion, and this is what Watchmen is like. There are no good guys. Even the characters that you look at and you say, okay, they were the good. It's okay. People would say like Night Owl is good. I mean, he's kind of a coward, right? And he doesn't. And when it comes down to the hard test, he doesn't really stand up to what he's supposed to do. Okay, so Ozymandias. I mean, oh, by the way, if you haven't read any of these comics, I mean, you're just gonna have to stop the video and go read them yourselves, because I'm not going to give like no spoilers or whatever. I'm just going to comment on the comics. So, someone like Ozymandias. It's a fantastic character. You can certainly justify some of the things he does, but he does something horrifically terrible in the end and doesn't have any faith in humanity or optimism for what else other people could do, thinks he has to take it into his own hands. Dr. Manhattan is a fantastic character who develops in a very unique way, and he in the end becomes incredibly alien and distant from humanity and has almost no humanity left because he's become something more than that, and therefore he's left the constraints even of morality. Rorschach, obviously someone where a lot of young people, especially the young, angry young men type guys, can relate to, and they think it's fantastic, and certainly has a certain moral ground he carves out that certainly has some consistency to it, but there's also some horrific methods that he uses that he thinks are justified because he thinks he's in the right and he thinks he is battling some overarching evil. So the comedian is someone where on an initial glance people will be like, this guy's a piece of shit, look at what terrible things he does, particularly in Vietnam, but then you realize he's just a man and he's facing the absurdity of history and he sees the way shit runs behind the scenes, and so yeah, for him, you look at all of this, and it is a joke. It is ridiculous. What can you do but laugh? Otherwise, you would cry, right? I mean, I probably shouldn't have gone as in-depth on Watchmen. This could be like a video about Watchmen, couldn't it? But so for me, Watchmen is fantastic. People will sometimes cite, I mean, I know Grant Morrison, this is one of his big problem with it, like the notion that the ending is absurd, the ending with the squid. Now, what I love about the ending is it's incredibly daring, and it makes it become a comic again. If it's deconstructionist and it's postmodern for the rest of it, at the end it becomes a comic again. That is a comic's ending. That's one thing I think is actually very good about it. And it is supposed to be shocking. It's not supposed to be something you can just process. There's one thing I enjoyed about it. V for Vendetta. Another absolute masterwork of the medium. I mean, this is a real masterpiece of style. The way it's done, so stylistic. It's so enjoyable. It's very coherent in terms of the kind of the concept of what it's supposed to be about. Has a great central character who, again, isn't just a good guy. He certainly has some huge flaws to him, but is compelling. He's certainly very charismatic in that sense. This, for me, is social commentary done right. It's not laying it on thick, as in like just telling you believe this or this is what's going on, but it's just a great social commentary to me is like satire. You don't just tell someone, haha, I am right and this person is wrong and you'll now see why they are wrong. What you do is you set up the components and you let it all play out. And the idea is the person enjoying that piece of art then sort of, if they think similar to you, comes to similar conclusions or sees kind of your perspective of what you were saying. You don't have to make it so blatantly obvious and tell people essentially what you're doing. I also think it's a bit prescient in as much as, yeah, this is the days before there were video cameras, security cameras on every street corner, which famously in the 90s in Britain led the world in terms of number of security cameras to citizens of its country. So it actually did kind of come to pass in some level as a monitored, not really police state, but a monitored, I guess intelligence state, you would say, which certainly is what happened a decade later or so. Now, Swamp Thing was a great example where he took someone else's character, in this case not even that great a character, totally changed it, and again just went to this scale and this scope of this is crazy, how's he done this? So like the parts where Swamp Thing's traveling through time, and the obviously the fantastic one is the one where the what do you call it, he has sex with that woman, basically the Abbey woman, and then there's obviously the fantastic one where that guy whose wife's dying of cancer goes and eats like I forget what you call it now, the fruit the vegetable that comes out of the tuber, or something that comes out of something and has a psychedelic experience. This is beautiful art. And again, it's daring to push these boundaries and do new things with a character and with this kind of thing that you just never would normally see. Then you got to look at, he also did The Killing Joke during this period. Now, funnily enough, this is one that he's kind of disowned to some degree. He doesn't think it was that good or that clever, but to me, it's a very powerful Batman story, and kind of the horrible nature of it. I think actually that's what makes it a great story, is that actually a lot of the Batman stories, they made it too fantastical, and there needed to be a story that was like, this is how brutal a Batman story would be. I mean, not in the real world, but just as fiction, you have to add more of a brutality. Otherwise, Batman becomes too absurd. Whereas he's absurd in a mythical sense here, but because the world he exists within deserves that. Now, certainly Frank Miller did some fantastic work within that genre and doing some quite brutal stuff. Year one, obviously, with Batman and Dark Knight Returns. Grant Morrison did some pretty good stuff with the Arkham Asylum, but this is a fantastic Batman story any way you want to cut it. His Superman stories he did these two stories that they are the best Superman stories ever told, and yet they were done 30 years ago, and the guy just did those two and then fucked off. I mean, he did For the Man Who Has Everything, which is an amazing story because of the way he takes Superman into like a dream type thing, off back to Krypton and reimagines Krypton. And the way he tells this story is very adult and very different from all the other Superman stories you see. And then Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow is just a classic. And like, this is one of the greatest one-shots you'll ever see. Just the way it's told. It's just a story that, again, it's like you give Alan Moore, you go, okay, here's the Superman universe. And he doesn't just do something that's like just what other people would do, but much better and better crafted. He just goes somewhere else that you thought, fuck, I never even thought you could really even do that with the Superman story. And that's what he does. And he does this amazing story. So one of the interesting things is, you haven't even got to the 90s yet. And yet this is when Alan Moore goes independent. He leaves DC, he has this fracas over the contract for the Watchmen, which they clearly did screw him on, and they purposely, almost willfully did it, and then they didn't make any real compromise, because at the time they didn't think it was that big a deal to have even a big creator like this. They thought they could let him go, which was real hubris and arrogance on their part, because if you look at the industry now comics isn't just about owning Watchmen's rights and making millions off that. It's about now selling properties and developing properties to movie studios, and therefore making movies that make you millions and billions. So actually now more than ever, they desperately need an Alan Moore, and they don't have one. I mean, theirs equivalent would be what Grant Morrison right now, Jeff Johns. These guys don't come up with the stuff that can make the amazing movie. Like if you had 4 or 5 Watchmen, not literally a Watchmen story, but of that scale that you could then turn into movies. That's where the huge money would be. That's where the top 20 films grossing of all time would be if you had access to that. You don't, because you just looked in the short term and screwed a guy in the short term thinking, well, I'll get all the money for this, and didn't realize what you'd given away there. You absolutely killed the golden goose if you're DC there. So when he left at that point in time, a lot of people think, because they're angry at him because they wanted more stories about Green Lantern and superhero and Superman, all this stuff, they get angry at him and they think, right, he just disappeared up his own arse at that point in time. He's a guy who couldn't get along with anyone. He just limited his own career, and he was never as good after that. I mean, I think actually a parallel I would draw here would be with Orson Welles, because Orson Welles obviously did his masterpieces early. The studio fucked with him. He eventually was on the outside looking in from the studio system. He had to go off to Europe. He was making these independent films, which are very good and have some very good redeeming qualities and some great acting performances by himself, but they can't quite compete on some level with some of the mainstream Hollywood movies because they don't have the budget and they don't have the staff, and it's just a lot more patchwork. Well, the difference is Orson Welles was limited by the fact that to make a Hollywood movie is one of the most expensive art projects you can undertake. So he didn't have access to those resources. The key as to why Alan Moore didn't fall off in that way or didn't experience the same difficulties and still could do as good or better work later in his career is because the beauty of comics is that all you need is your own mind, your own writing ability, and an artist. If you have those 3 things, you can create anything in comics. There is no budget. There is none of that. You just have to be able to pay those 2 people, and you can do anything in comics. And this is what Alejandro Jodorowsky realized after he lost the funding for his films. So whereas Orson Welles toiled and struggled and did what he could, people like Alan Moore and Alejandro Jodorowsky have done everything they wanted to do in comics. That's what's so beautiful about it. Now, it is worth saying that if Alan Moore had stayed with DC, if they somehow had worked it out, he would have done some fantastic work there. I mean, famously, he wrote that script for I think it was called Twilight of the Superheroes, which was going to be his own crisis type event. And that was a fantastic concept. I mean, what he did with that, you can go and read it online. He was clearly going to do some revolutionary shit with that. And imagine if he'd done that. Likewise, you see how he took all those other characters that were like failing characters and made magic out of them. Or you see how he took someone else's character and made it his own. I mean, imagine what he could have done with some of those other stories if he'd actually done a full-length run on a Green Lantern or the Flash or something. So clearly he would have done something revolutionary and probably would have taken some of the same turns he took with his own characters later, but with these established characters. So another aspect of Alan Moore's impact is that people like DC try to downplay him, in as much as people often say one of the areas Alan Moore's arrogant or conceited in is that he's made these comments where he'll say like, oh, a lot of comics is just like crap now, and like the medium in general, like people just don't do a lot of creative stuff in it, and I haven't seen many ideas out of it. And he's famously said that to him it's like DC just recycles all his ideas, and it's like they're rooting around in his trash cans from years ago, rubbish bins if you're in England, and they're just picking out old ideas and then just making that. And then people think, think that's ridiculous. Oh, how can you say that? You just look at the sheer amount of stuff. I mean, Brightest Night, that whole concept for that event to do with Green Lantern, that came from an Alan Moore comic. Now, you can say, but it was only just one comic and it was from a while ago and it's just a basic... Well, then why do it? Why not come up with your own idea? Exactly. Then you got to look at... They did the Before Watchmen. They actually dared to take one of those perfect pieces of art that's self-contained entirely and go, fuck it, let's just have a bunch of other people. Some of them hacks and not very good writers, just do their own their own prequels and different versions of it. I mean, what... Just cashing in on the Watchmen name and movie, basically. Then you got to look at the fact that DC has made a killing off Hellblazer. This is John Constantine, his character that he created as a throwaway character in the Swamp Thing, has been one of the most longest running comics at DC from the 90s onwards. And I guess 80s, I can't remember the first one launched, I think it would be late 80s. And this is a character that was his, and they constantly kept it alive and running. The Swamp Thing comics were actually... It's clearly influenced the 80s Swamp Thing movies, which not many people have seen, admittedly, and were almost used in a modern-day reboot of the movie. They were going to do a movie that was going to be with Vincenzo Natali, who was the guy who directed Cube and directed Cypher and Splice. Cypher, a very underrated movie, by the way. A great sci-fi director, and he was going to be the director, and they were going to go with some of the plot points from Alan Moore's comics. You can see, actually, from some of the script that was online. The Arrow TV show is going to adapt, apparently, for the Man Who Has Everything, but on their show, which is the Superman story, but they're obviously about Green Arrow. He has had more movies created around his comics, despite not participating in them at all, than any other comics creator I can think of. The closest I can think of is Mark Miller, and that doesn't entirely count, because Mark Miller, quite clearly over the last 15 years, has started to create comics purely to mine for movies, because he's got that credibility and that in where Hollywood wants to work with him. And obviously, it's the most obvious relationship as well, because Mark Miller does do that kind of Tarantino style, where his stylistic approach and kind of the tone and his dialogue fits a movie, because he's clearly influenced by movies. So to him, it makes sense. Whereas Alan Moore's are very dense and they're very much of the comics medium. Therefore, his actually makes some of the least sense, aside from the scope of his name, and as a result, the fact that people will go and see it if they've heard of something and some of the fantastic ideas. His don't necessarily make as much sense to make into movies, and that's why a lot of them aren't very good as movies, quite frankly. The best one is probably V for Vendetta, and that has some good things about it, but some of the things they change, they don't change them for the better. They don't do anything unique with it. And some of it was laid on a bit too thick. Like, they missed some of the nuance, I thought, in that sense. Even if they were going to recreate it and adapt it. I mean, obviously, I did a video about adaptation, how you shouldn't necessarily do things exactly the same. Now, another reason why Alan Moore was continually reinventing himself and became even better in many senses, especially artistically, after leaving DC, and didn't just die off and do a lot of independent stuff that wasn't as good. It wasn't like where, Jimmy Page left Led Zeppelin. I mean, they obviously disbanded, but it wasn't like that, and then went off and did a bunch of stuff that was just meh, it was just average and all right, and it's not very good and nowhere near the scale. No, it wasn't like that. One of the things about Alan Moore is he clearly didn't want to do the same thing over and over again. He wasn't just going to do something really great and then go, right, I'll stick with that and just do it for 60 years. Now, fair play if people do that and they're a Charles M. Schultz guy and they do some good work. That's great. But he wanted to be someone who pushed himself in a way that I can really respect, to innovate what he's doing, to go and do something entirely new, or to take something else that you've never tried before and learn it and try and see if you can do a different version of that, or do a very good version of that, or pay homage to an aspect of the genre. And he's gone into all these different areas that no one in the history of comics has the same versatility, has the same breadth, the width to the scale of their work. I don't know why I keep getting caught with that word. It must just be too late at night. So when you look at his post-DC work, you've got to start off with when he did his independent work. It was like 93 to 96 or something, I think. Now, first and foremost, this is when he declared himself on his 40th birthday to be a magician. He was going to become a practicing magician, and clearly that was a very important aspect for his work. I mean, there's a video, which I'll link down below if I can find it. It was on Vimeo, where he's actually talking at some sort of an art exhibit or something. Or was it the speech that he gave for the Harvey Pekar fund to build him a statue or something, where he talks about actually an Enochian magic experience he had on mushrooms, so psilocybin, along with Steve Moore, where he made contact with some sort of an angel or something. And clearly this has all been very important stuff in his life. He's become a student of the occult entirely. His own personal mythos, which he's created, is that he worships the snake god Glykon, who purposely was actually known to be a sock puppet and was kind of not a real religious experience at all, back in early AD period. And his independent period has some great work in it. I mean, obviously the masterpiece is From Hell. I mean, this is a book that took a long time to write because he had to research it a lot, and he does something totally unique with the story of Jack the Ripper. And I think how much Jack the Ripper has proliferated throughout culture and literature, and yet he takes it, does something utterly unique with it. And it's a monster of a piece of work, but it's so worth getting through, and it has such a unique concept and way that he treats the material. Then you've got, obviously, A Lost Girls was something he did in this period of time, even though it was only published like 20 years later. I'm not that hot on this one, quite frankly. It's not that great. I mean, I can see what he's doing there. I think the concept is a good idea. I think even some of the execution, because it is Alan Moore, is good. It just isn't that great when you compared to the rest of his oeuvre, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned. Sadly, Big Numbers, which would have, in theory, been one of his magnum opus, didn't ever get completed. I can see where he was starting to go with that, and the artwork was fantastic. That artist was an amazing artist, but for certain reasons, which you'd have to research online if you care about it, it never got finished, which is a shame. Now, for me, the real rough period for him was the Image era, which was right after this, where he's doing mainstream comics again, but now for Image, which is outside of the big two of Marvel and DC. And Image, for a while in the 90s, was doing very, very well. They broke away, and they were doing some revolutionary work. They're not necessarily great work in many senses, because it was mainly the artists, and they were way too much about style over substance. But one thing people don't give credit to, okay, there is some rough, some not that great stuff in the Image era, but first and foremost, he did Supreme at this point in time, where again, he took someone else's character, Rob Liefeld's Supreme, who's obviously an analog for Superman, and this is fantastic work, some of the best of Alan Moore's career, because this is a love letter to the Silver Age Superman. My favourite period, actually, of comics prior to this era of Alan Moore and all the rest of it, in the past. Superman of the Silver Age is just the best stuff. The way he takes all that, he has some meta contextual stuff with it, he has some postmodern elements to it, but as a lot of it still is set within that aspect and recreating it, and it's fantastic work. It's really, really great stuff. If you ever wished, after those 2 Superman stories he did, which everyone acknowledges are great, I wish he'd done more on Superman. Well, he did. It's just called Supreme. Go and read these comics. They're amazing. One part of his Image work that never gets credit, but is actually pretty decent, is I think the most overlooked aspect, aside from Supreme, is Judgment Day. He did this Judgment Day story, which is in the Youngblood universe, and okay, it's not fantastic because the characters in Youngblood aren't very good, and the art is just garbage for this, but the actual story and what he does with it and how he makes this huge event style story is really out there. I mean, it's really crazy what it does with it. And it doesn't all hang together, it doesn't all work, but it's daring. It's a flawed gem in that particular sense. Now, what's interesting is his work after this period is ABC, Wildstorm, and then beyond that. Originally, I mean, I was the same when I got into comics. I thought it wasn't as good, and it didn't seem as interesting, as appealing conceptually, or as exciting. But I actually realized over the years, that's because I didn't bring enough to the table. I wasn't ready artistically to consume and enjoy and appreciate that sort of stuff on the level that it was written. I mean, the degree of mastery of the medium within some of his later stuff is unbelievable. I mean, the level of artistry just increases and goes to a peak that I don't think anyone's ever hit. So for ABC, what was great about the ABC period, America's Best Comics, is this is just fantastic genre work. If you like what he did on Supreme, this is more of that sort of stuff, because he's so inventive with what he does, yet stays within some of the basic boundaries of the genre type stuff. He's able to take on different voices almost in terms of how he tells the story, because he's taken on different parts of subgenres and styles he just adapts to with such quick ease and becomes very good and very masterful in a very short amount of time, short amount of issues. So, okay, one of the best ABC comics is Promethea. Promethea is just a beautiful piece of art. This is something where, as a coherent unit, yes, a lot of it is about the Western occult, Western ceremonial magical system and tradition and hermeticism, sure, and if people have no interest in that, it might be hard to get through some of it. But obviously I personally have some interest in that area. But even beyond that, just the way he tells the story, he uses that essentially as an excuse to be able to show you new worlds and vistas and imaginations and concepts that you otherwise wouldn't get in a comic. And I have to say as well, this is one of the best ever pairings of Alan Moore with an artist, because the artwork from J.H. Williams III here is the best that guy has ever done. I mean, just the way he has to change up his style from some of the covers, you almost can't believe one person did all this artwork. It's so phenomenal. It's mind-boggling. Okay, then you've got to look at some of the other stuff. So Top 10 was a great TV police procedural, but set in its own unique concept of everyone in this universe is a superhero except this one girl. I mean, what a great concept. That, like, it feels like you're reading The West Wing or something. This could have run for a long time. It's really great. Tom Strong is, again, it's very much a genre piece. It's a period piece of comics from the past, but it's these short stories. One of the things he really perfected at ABC was how to do short stories and in an old-fashioned sort of pulp era style, but do his own thing with them and have his own little one idea that's creative, and he works it out in, you know, they're 8 or 9 pages, and they're fun to read. They're really, it's quick-paced stuff. It's more Grant Morrison type speed, actually, I think, in some ways, but the craftsmanship is fantastic, and he really gets into a groove there. So Tom Strong's really good stuff. Then you got to go to Tomorrow's Stories. I think this is very underrated because some of this stuff is really funny. This is the best Alan Moore series, in my opinion, for humor, for comedy. The way it's just parodying stuff, and it's referential to things that are in the news at the time. I mean, that like Jerry Springer ripoff that he does is fantastic. And he actually has one story within this that I think is up there with some of the best individuals comic strips ever written. It's this story, I forget the name of it, where it all takes place within a building, and each set of panels, so the top line is one floor of the building, the next one's another line, and the next one's another one, and it's showing through different time periods on the different floors, if I remember correctly. I can't quite remember how that goes. But and the way it's such a unique story. I've never seen a story set up that way. And the execution towards the end is brilliant, and it's poignant, and it's just beautiful, and it's tragic. It's just so well done. And it's one comic where, because it's in his side work, not many people have necessarily read it, but it's worth hunting down that one comic and reading it. It's in Tomorrow's Stories, wherever you can find it. Then you got to look at his Wildstorm period. Now, at Wildstorm, okay, one of the best things he did at Wildstorm was when he took over WildC.A.T.s. Again, this is a comic that wasn't that great, actually, quite frankly. It was all right. I mean, like, the Casey era was not bad, actually. He did something unique with it. But in general, not a great set of characters. But when he takes it over, it becomes a really, really good story. I mean, he does something unique with it. He manages to really figure out the characters, but then again take them to a degree that they'd never gone to, and put them in different parts of the universe and tell out their story. And again, a side character he creates, which goes on to be used more, it was used in Sleeper and a bunch of other comics, is Tao, T-A-O, acronym. Now, what a fantastic character this was. A great villain, the very unique concept, and the way it plays out and the way he starts out at is so you can see how he understood what he was doing from very early on with that, even though it seems like it's just a side character. There's also, during the Wildstorm era, a comic he did, which is a one-shot from Majestic, which was, again, a Superman analog, called The Big Chill. And this is literally, for me, one of my top 5 issues of any comic in history, because it's a one-off self-contained story, but where it goes, the process of it is like a fantastic, it's like one of those amazing stage plays or movies where they only have like 2 or 3 characters in them, but it becomes so engrossing, the back and forth, that you really get into it, and at the end you realize that they can make it incredibly intense because it's only a few characters. It's like that, and then where it ends, the ending, one of the most satisfying and yet unique endings in the history of comics. It's fantastic. People have to hunt that down. Then you look, even though it started in the ABC era, obviously it went beyond that, is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Now, actually, I'm not that big a fan of this overall. Like, I like a lot of it. It's clever, and certainly the historical references and the fictional references are good. Just for me, it doesn't quite strike some kind of a chord. It's one of those ones where I just read it and enjoyed it, but it wasn't like a masterpiece for me. I can see that for him, it was a labor of love. He was doing a lot of work in it. It was an excuse to hunt down lots of different references and to really read into those and try and replicate some of the style. I certainly like how it changes style and it's daring in terms of the timeline. But yeah, something about it isn't quite like up there on the scale of some of the other great works for me. His Lovecraft stuff, again, I'm not like a huge Lovecraft fan personally, and I don't really like that pulp style as much in fantasy and sci-fi. If you do, I can see the appeal of it. So I read it. Yeah, it's enjoyable enough on some level, but it's not something that I highlight as like a great piece. One thing that I do think passed a lot of people by was when he did the Crossed 100 trade, which was he took over Garth Ennis's Crossed, and again, he took someone else's concept, did something totally unique with it. I mean, the way it has a new language within it, where you have to sort of read the comic and learn this language on kind of an unconscious level as you're reading it, but it does start to kick in, you start to understand something. That's a really unique experience. And then this is a book where the ending, I won't give any of it away, but the ending is just something you can't see coming, and you kind of have to really It just has to be witnessed. I won't even say what the response to it is, the reaction is. Now, within his kind of miscellaneous, his rarities, his side stuff, there's some stuff out there that's actually very well worth tracking down because it has certain quality to it. So, one thing I think is great is where he did these performance pieces that Eddie Campbell, his artist from Hell, made into comics. And that was where he did the book that was The Disease of Language. So it was like Snakes and Ladders and The Birth Call were these two pieces that were put into this book, The Disease of Language. Now, The Birth Call is one of my favorite Alan Moore things he's ever done. It's so poignant. It's so bittersweet. It's so actually very autobiographical, unlike a lot of his work. And it's almost something that encapsulates a life. It's almost Proustian in that sense. So there's something very special about this. It's funny that he didn't actually make the comic in that sense. He just did the performance piece, and someone else made it into a comic. Because this is something which, again, to me shows. I mean, I guess it wasn't made as a comic. So that's the kind of caveat I'm giving. It kind of shows something unique you could do within the comics medium. I mean, it really is its own little psychedelic artifact, and it reminds me of the kind of moment of clarity and yet visionary element that you'll sometimes get from psychedelic experiences, which I think are why to some people, yes, the drugs aren't addictive, but almost that aspect is addictive, that insight that you might not get through normal means otherwise. So I think that's certainly something to look out for. He's done a bunch of essays that were all very good. I mean, one of the best ones is Fossil Angels, which is kind of his take on magic when he's early on getting into it. And the conclusions he comes to and the way he weaves in and out of history and art. And basically it's about like how art is magic to him in his philosophy is really, it's certainly thought-provoking. It's something that you've got to really digest. It's not necessarily something you're going to see that way, but it really informs a lot of the philosophy of how he's clearly worked since that period where he declared himself the magician. His Stan Lee takedown is brutal, but for people who venerate that guy, it has to be read because I think you should always try and find out the flaws of people who otherwise, to some people, that would be their hero or someone who thinks a great guy. I think it's always worth knowing that stuff and being able to make your own conclusions. He actually did a piece, which again is only going to be interesting to occult people, but his piece called Beyond Our Ken, which was kind of an obituary, a tribute to Kenneth Grant, the English occultist, is a really interesting take on a lot of Kenneth Grant's stuff because it was so sprawling and clearly went into almost semi-fictional areas and you couldn't quite always tell, was he joking here? Was he really doing this stuff? I mean, I think it's a great insight into that aspect by someone who's clearly studied a lot of these books and is immersed in that area. And one piece of his rarities that I want to highlight as a final thing is The Mirror of Love, because he wrote this piece in response to kind of the homophobia of, I forget what exact period. I'd assume it's in the early 90s because I think it was his independent period where he wrote this. But this is a piece that really, I mean, the sentiment to this is really beautiful. I think actually it's something where if you're someone who is not in any way a homosexual, and so as a result, you can't necessarily relate to homosexual people because you aren't one, therefore you can't know what it's like to be them. And you wouldn't want, if you're like me, you wouldn't want to presume you would. And it doesn't necessarily interest you because, again, it's a different world to you. This is something where it kind of relates it in an aspect or a way that is just kind of, it's very unique. I can't really think of much else that ever did it in that way. And obviously I acknowledge that as a valid form of love between people who happen to be that way, and that's what they are. And in that sense, this has some real great artistic value to it, beyond even just the message of like, don't be a homophobe, essentially, would be probably a gist you have to take away if you read this, I'd imagine. Now, not everything Alan Moore has ever done hits or is great. I mean, he certainly did some bad stuff at Image, like the Spawn episode that is about Spawn becoming the Ipsissimus is fucking garbage. That's some really bad stuff. Like, even the concept of that is terrible. Like, I don't know what he was thinking with that. He did some kind of whack stuff in the Wildstorm era as a result of that Wild Worlds book. It's worth it, yeah, for the Big Chill and some of the other pieces. But there are some kind of crap comics in that, like that one where it's about that voodoo woman who's like a stripper. That did not work whatsoever. That was pretty bad. Now, the thing about Alan Moore is he has incredible plots. I think he has probably the best plotting in the history of comics. He's unparalleled. When you consider the way comics are written is month to month in general. Most people are writing the next month after the first one's finished. The fact that he can have the core of the concept and a lot of the later details, but then still write himself to the point he wants to get to, shows the level of mastery this guy has, because his plots end up looking like someone who sat down and for 3 years wrote a whole novel and at any point could change what they wanted to do. That's how great he is at the craft of comics and how good his ideas initially are as well. He's fantastic at fleshing out characters. When he takes a character someone else wrote, he does something different with it because he breaks it down. He really takes... It's funny he only became a magician when his 40th birthday, because for characters like Swamp Thing, he's taken almost an alchemical approach. It's that aspect of you dissolve the character, you break it apart, you see what the constituents are, and you rebuild it into something new in your image, in a sense, of what your idea of this character is and what the essential components are, and then you build from that. That's what he does in nearly all of his comics. And also, he's a visionary. He's someone who doesn't see certain rules or limitations and is willing to take the character and just go wherever he thinks the character should or could go. He doesn't think, what am I bound by within this medium? And yes, he's got the credibility and kind of the green light to do that in a way other people don't, but he's earned that through his toil and through his efforts and through his initial revolutionary acts within the comics medium. He's someone where he has done so much for the medium itself. I mean, he not only broke all the rules and revolutionized comics, but he did it while still respecting where it came from and while loving where it came from. And as a result, he didn't just tear it down. He did things a different way, but at times it's an homage. It's a tribute to some of the past of Tom Strong. You look obviously at Supreme. You look at his Superman stories. These are absolutely a tribute to the comics of the past and what he loved about them when he was a boy. I think he's wrongly presented as someone who is just postmodern, who just takes... The notion is, and this is a very Grant Morrison rebuke, is that he just takes these comics characters, which are supposed to be artistic and on a mythic level, and he just drags them into the real world and shows what they would be like in a real world with postmodernism and brutal violence. No, a few of his 80s comics were like that. But aside from that, that's really not what he's doing at all. I mean, you look at something like Promethea, you look at something like Tomorrow's Stories and Tom Strong, he's in no way doing that with these characters. I mean, he's doing something very much within the genre, within the fantasy realm. Particularly Promethea is pretty much a story where the gist of it is, as later you would find out is one of his key philosophies, that the imagination is its own realm, comics take place there, and in fact, the way we think and dream of things take place there, and in the end, it's the other way around. We mine ideas from that and bring them into the real world in our real lives to become inventions and concepts and then interact with each other and then re-enter the imaginary world. So I don't think that's the case at all. It's not my reading of his work at all. I think if you look at his output, he has increased in skill and execution year on year on year. He's crucially one of the best of all time at working with different artists. Nearly all of his projects have different artists, and it's justified. I mean, admittedly, part of it's because he fell out with so many of them over the years. He certainly seems like he can, with certain personality types, be difficult to get along with. But it also reminds me of the way Stanley Kubrick, when he entered his real auteur period, was working with different main actors for each of his movies. And as a result, they all, each have a very distinct feel as movies, even though they're all Stanley Kubrick movies. I think in that sense, Alan Moore casts different actors for most of his pieces, even though it's an Alan Moore comic still. His scripts famously are legendary in terms of how dense and how much information they give. And the key thing is, it's not just that he tells the artist how to draw absolutely everything. He doesn't. He does trust the artists to do what they want to do and to use their vision as well. But what he does with the long scripts, though, is convey to the artist in almost a Proustian sense what he was thinking and what his observations are and his conclusions. So the artist takes all of that in, and then when they're writing it, they start drawing their own style, but it's an Alan Moore thing that they're drawing. The idea, the genesis comes from him and sparks some inspiration within them at that point in time. And I think that's something that really bears out in his work. Now, his current day stuff is maybe not the best period of his career. He's still doing some good stuff, but he's kind of winding down his comics period, apparently. It seems like he's going to go more into poetry or novels beyond this. So he's doing Providence at the moment, which is pretty much almost finished, which is more Lovecraft stuff. But this is really daring in terms of this kind of what the concept behind it is for it being Lovecraft. Some of the other stuff, Neonomicon, The Courtyard, was more straight Lovecraft, but just with a modern twist. This is kind of pushing some of the boundaries on the Lovecraft stuff, especially the kind of referential manner to Lovecraft's life itself. Almost reminds me of Naked Lunch in that particular sense, the David Cronenberg movie, not the book. He's obviously still doing The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which again, I mean, I'm just not that super into, but I think it's pretty good still. It's definitely worth reading. And one thing I'm really looking forward to, actually, is the Moon and Serpent bumper book of magic that he'd been working on with Steve Moore. No relation is what you famously supposed to say. It's not related. But Steve Moore's obviously since died, and Alan Moore's going to finish it up. This is going to be a way of telling about magic, but for children. And so the reason why that's a fantastic concept is a lot of magic books, even the beginner type ones, they have a hard time with it because, again, it's not something that can necessarily be broken down in the most nuts and bolts way, because it's just not really about that. It is about existing on this imaginal realm, on this mythic level, and therefore seeing how he condenses down and conveys in simple terms some of these aspects is something I can't wait to see, because he is a great artist, and I want to see how these things come through the lens, the prism of his work and his personality to be expressed for what he would assume. I mean, he's always said famously that his his audience would be, I think he said like a smart 14-year-old or something. That it would make sense as to how that's who he's trying to speak to, because that's what he thinks of himself as when he was reading comics. And I'll be interested to see how he conveys some of these very high concept stuff into towards that kind of a demographic. Now, if you want to know more about Alan Moore, there are 3 key pieces of work external to him that I would get involved with, or rather hunt down, because they really will tell you a lot about his philosophy and the way he thinks, and tie a lot of his work together and show what he was attempting with it. So first and foremost, I would say to get a book by Eric L. Blavatsky, and it's called Alan Moore Conversations. And what he does is cull some of the best interviews Alan Moore did throughout his career. I think the book came out in maybe like 2003, so there's not going to be anything beyond that. But these conversations, Alan Moore doesn't just talk about a comic he's doing and, here's what the idea was and here's what I was going to do. Instead, he brings in cultural stuff and he talks about other ideas that he's been reading about in other books. And the way he talks in itself is so incredibly interesting. I'd go and watch a documentary called The Mindscape of Alan Moore. This is a really, really fantastic documentary. I've watched it so many times. It's so enjoyable. The way it ties together some of the key themes and philosophies of his life and his career, and the way he can reinterpret his own work for you in a way that makes sense, even if it's different from how you might see it. It's just a fantastic documentary. And sure, some of it might be a bit cheesy because the guy who made it isn't necessarily a fantastic documentary maker, but the subject matter is so good that it hangs together. And finally, there's Magic Words, which was a biography written only a couple of years ago by Lance Parkin, which really goes in depth and covers all of Alan Moore's career. And it doesn't just do it. It's not a hagiography. It's not trying to make him into a saint or whitewash him. It has some parts in there where it gives like what he thinks of as the other side or other people's sides or some of the negative things that were said about Alan Moore. And so it really goes in depth. And this gives you the full breadth, like very, very day-to-day detail of this guy's career.